Hello, and welcome to my little talk about my research work I did over the summer, thanks to my first year research experience grant that I graciously received. Um, my paper is Two Birds with One Stone, all about fixing climate change and stopping the new Cold War, which I worked on with Professor Jane Cramer over the summer full time. What are we talking about here? What new Cold War? What's climate change? Great questions. Let's jump right in. Many people feel today that humanity is doomed. In some surveys, up to 75% of respondents view the future as frightening, and over 12% of Americans say that they struggle to stop themselves from consuming bad news about global warming. It really does seem like we are in a situation that is doomed, and many people feel that way. Additionally, I'm not only referring to climate here. Most people are afraid of the future climate and what that might entail. But a lot of people are also afraid about a possible US-China conflict. And we hear that a lot from war hawks, whether it be Congress people or people in think tanks who talk about a US-China conflict as if it is certain to happen at some point in the future. And people truly believe that both these scenarios are likely, a climate disaster and a war with China. Both outcomes could be the end of the human race, either by nuclear winter or by the evisceration of our climate's livable atmosphere. But the truth is that these 2 points aren't as dead set as many people believe they are. This potential conflict with US and China isn't necessarily an inevitable result of two great powers, but is something that we are causing by our investments in defense and by taking actions which provoke the Chinese government and cause them to respond in kind, which we then frame as their militarism and that they're seeking war with the US. Similarly, we frame climate as if it is an inevitable disaster that is upon us, because the narrative has largely been won by the fossil fuel industry, which want us to believe that the only way forward is resilience and not total transition. The truth, though, is very different once you look at the science. Let's start with the problem as a whole. Where are we at today and how did we get here? In this past year, 2022, we had a $753 billion Department of Defense budget, with almost half of all discretionary spending that gets to be sent by the president and Congress going to defense. Compare that to a $24 billion climate budget, which has been touted as the most impressive investment in climate by a president ever before. That's less than 0.0004% of all federal spending being allocated to climate. Climate fuel disasters cost the US last year in the year of 2022, $165 billion. And future climate inaction could cost the government up to $2 trillion a year. The potential impact here is immeasurable. And the important thing to do here is to compare these two budgets one along each other. People often talk about how impressive this climate investment is. And people often talk about how bloated our defense budget is. But people don't often marry those two ideas and realize that this bloat is directly causing us not to invest in other more pressing areas. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but for now, just sink in how difficult a scenario we are in currently, especially once you consider the fact that curbing climate change is a possibility. On the right here, you see some graphs that were put together by the IPCC, an international organization that conducts scientific research on climate change. They believe that if we were to, as a world, be able to commit $300 billion a country a year by 2030, we would be able to avoid the 1.5 degrees Celsius increase from pre-industrial global temperature that is largely believed to be the point of no return for our global climate. Let me rephrase that in a way that really emphasizes that impact. A $300 billion a year investment, which is less than half of the current defense budget, could prevent a global climate disaster. And importantly, we've known about this target. This isn't some new research that has just appeared. Global talks have targeted a $100 billion a year target since 2009, and yet developed countries in the most recent assessment in 2021 have only been contributing around $83 billion a year, and that's from the OECD. Importantly as well, the current scenario of climate investment is very tenuous. Nearly $384 billion in climate finance every year is borrowed, which means that a lot of the money that's going into direct energy investments and moving us towards a more sustainable future is coming out of our banks and our unstable financial system. The Secretary General of the International Monetary Fund has highlighted this as an area of potential future instability if climate disasters continue to increase in scale, as we believe that they will be. The point here is that significant targeted spending could curb a permanent climate disaster, but we have to do that part, and that's what's really hard. Importantly here too, the investment we've made in expanding our Department of Defense budget over the last 20 years has directly resulted in a response from the Chinese government. We've seen that their stockpile of nukes has tripled over the last 20 years. And the DoD believes that by 2035, they could have over 1,500 nukes, when the trend as a whole, as a world, over the last 60 years has been a significantly reduced strategic stockpile of nukes. We're trending towards potential Armageddon once again when we've been moving away from it for so long. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but know that we are at an important decision point when it comes to how we treat nuclear conflict in the current day and age. Even though it's not nearly talked about as much as climate is, it is just as important for our generation. But fortunately, governments are taking steps to fix this all. The world leaders are drafting new budgetary commitments, defense spending is beginning to decline, and the UN is coordinating response. If that last one didn't give it away, I'm kidding. Unfortunately, none of these steps are being taken, and that's why it's important to know about these issues and begin to do the research to know what we can be doing that we're not doing. Nuclear spending in the US is skyrocketing, as you can see on the figure on the right. In the last 3 fiscal years, we've reached a level of spending that hasn't been touched in over 10 years. The US outspends China's defense budget by 3 times over, and we're $267 billion a year behind the 2030 target that I mentioned earlier set by the IPCC. And the specific culprit that I'm going to get into in my research and here today is the Missile Defense Agency, which destabilized peace, our climate, and our economic situation. This is a perfect example of when defense is offensive, and when we spend so much money on programs that don't work or contribute to security or the well-being of Americans, that it has a knock-on effect that is massive. So let's start with this question. When is defense offensive? Missile defense. How could that possibly incite this militarist response in China and cause nuclear spending to skyrocket? Great question. It really all goes back to Reagan, like a lot of things do. Missile defense began in 1962, right at the beginnings of the Cold War, when the threat of nuclear war was believed to be at its peak, at least during the time. Scientists believed that if there was a way to develop a system which would defend a country from missiles, it would be an effective deterrent for a nuclear attack. And importantly, it could protect people if a nuclear missile was on the way to your place of residence. Reagan was really the first person to take this idea and run with it. He, in 1983, launched the Star Wars initiative, you may have heard of, and proposed it as a solution to the Cold War, basically. He really did try to run with that and say that if we were to develop effective missile defense, no American would ever have to worry about being blown up by a nuclear missile again, which sounds like a fantastic world. But the issue is that idea is theoretically impossible, incredibly expensive, and actually is inherently insecure. Instead of making Americans more safe, it makes us less safe. And we'll get into that. The first thing to understand and to visualize is imagine trying to shoot a bullet with a bullet. It's incredibly difficult because not only do you have to intercept the moving bullet, but you have to know where the bullet will be in the future so that you can shoot your gun ahead of time and then hit it. Now imagine that with missiles that go beyond our atmosphere, that have countermeasures and dozens of warheads in a coordinated attack with hundreds of missiles, where we don't even know, we don't often have less than a few minutes to make the decision on whether or not to launch our own missiles and how to respond. It's an incredibly difficult task to accomplish. And that's why this program has been so expensive, has been around for over 60 years, and has been so poorly implemented. There are 3 specific initiatives that I'm going to highlight here today. One is the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense, GMD, which is, as seen on this graphic, the ground-based tracking radar and the threat missile launch. And this is what this graphic is representing, actually, is GMD. It has all of these complex systems that basically use different forms of radar and sensors and sorts to launch a missile at a missile and attempt to shoot the bullet with a bullet. FAD functions in a very similar way, as well as Aegis. The main differentiator here is the way that they're implemented. GMD is a specific site that is on American soil, at least currently, and is set to launch missiles, while THAAD is a battery that can be moved and deployed to different places. There's currently one in South Korea. And Aegis is intended to be stationed on ships, but also can be put on the ground. Together, these make up the bulk of our missile defense and have existed for dozens of years as the main programs that this agency has tried to implement. However, those 60 years have been incredibly unsuccessful. These programs continue to fail flight tests, which are often in very highly favorable conditions. Most of these really took off in the 90s. And when you look back there, you see reports of consistent flight test failures. For example, here, I really enjoy this one where it says, ground-based radar fails in 3rd THAAD test, intercept set for 4th, and then missile defense system fails 4th test. They consistently were unable to hit their targets, and it clearly became obvious that this concept of a bullet shooting a bullet was incredibly difficult, because all of these tests were in highly favorable conditions. A lot of them were actually performed on the ground just to see if this concept was even feasible. As for how those tests are conducted, that's an entirely different discussion. The point here is, these programs have been around for so long, and these tests are so expensive, with each costing hundreds of millions of dollars, and they continue to fail at them. That is especially notable here, with 2 out of 12 tests in the last 20 years being successful. It's been proven that these systems simply don't work. And here's a great quote from an article that was by a researcher in 1999, analyzing whether or not these tests will ever be successful. They stated that it would be extremely risky to claim that these systems could protect the nation from an attack, because we can never be fully confident that they will work. Those favorable test conditions will never be replicated in real life, because it will never be one missile that needs to be shot down. It'll be hundreds, with decoys, with imperfect weather conditions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what that means is that we will never know if we have enough interceptors for the amount of missiles we can expect to receive. So is there any way that missile defense can work? Maybe. The truth is that we've seen it implemented in scenarios where it has been proven to be functional. The Patriot missile system you may have heard about, because it was recently deployed in Ukraine to shoot down Russian aircraft and missiles. And it's been shown to be highly effective in Ukraine. But the important thing to understand here is that that program itself is nearly 45 years old, and it has in and of itself cost dozens of billions of dollars of taxpayer money, and has failed to perform in the battlefield when it has been deployed previously before. It was well documented during the Gulf War in 1991 that the Patriot missile defense system just failed to protect American troops. And the Patriot system functions on a much smaller scale. It attempts to protect a small group of people compared to THAAD, GMD, and Aegis, which are doing super high altitude, often beyond atmospheric defense of missiles. My point here is that the theory behind it is just not there to prove that these systems could work. And when they have been proven to work, it's in very limited scenarios, which will never be replicated in real life battlefield situations. or it's just such a limited scope and altitude that it doesn't actually provide any defense at all. The second main issue is that these programs are incredibly expensive. The Patriot batteries that I just referred to and you may have heard about cost $1 billion each just to have the battery. That's not including the missiles, the training of the crew, and the billions and billions of research costs that got us to that point today. Just imagine what that might cost to go and build a battery like that for atmospheric defense. Americans have actually spent in their taxes $410 billion over the last 40 years on failed programs. And the really big question to ask here is how much more will they spend? We've overspent the planned budgets, which you see here on the graph in the gray dashed lines, and are continuing to increase the amount of money we're spending on missile defense. There's an important uptick in 2000 that comes around when we had this major policy reversal. Because the important thing to understand is that we've known that these systems haven't worked for dozens of years. You saw articles earlier from the 90s where they were failing tests. It is merely a ebb and flow of what is politically relevant and what will make people feel secure, or what our contractors offering to build, as to whether or not these systems get invested in. And then looking into the future over the next 5 years, we're already allocated to spend 42 billion on these non-functional programs. For example, there are 6 more of those high altitude defense batteries that I referred to early on, FAD, that are intended to be built and deployed in different zones. Each one costs $8.1 billion just to deploy it, and has on top of that, $15 billion lifetime cost. A new interceptor program for GMD is being trialed. The new interceptor basically means that they're reanalyzing the missile and trying to build a new vehicle to launch from the missile and kill the incoming nuclear missile. That program in and of itself is already allocated to cost 15 billion, and it's the second of that kind to ever come about. We previously were exploring a new interceptor for GMD and then scrapped it after it cost $17 billion because it just didn't work. We continue operating in these cycles of spending billions and billions of dollars on new research and then abandoning it when it's realized that the theory cannot be implemented in real life. So what do the next 10 years look like? Or the next 20? We can see below in my historical comparative cost chart that it's, the last 20 years have cost the last 30 years have cost us 300 billion almost. What's to say that the next 20 and the next 30 won't cost even more than that? The truth is that we're experiencing what's a lot of experts call pork. And that's why Porky the Pig here is showing, is it Daffy the Duck? Some missiles here. Pork is effectively, it's an old term from the 19th century to refer to when politicians attach money to budgets that isn't requested by the president. That's the most limited definition. But essentially, it's when a legislator determines that they want to add a special project to the budget because it benefits them in their district or for some external reason. Often it is that first one. There are a lot of politicians in districts where the Department of Defense will promise to station missile batteries or put manufacturing in, or even are just being lobbied by some of the largest defense contractors in the country. The Department of Defense is actually the #1 employer in the United States and the #2 employer in the world. And when you look at these politicians, they're often paid huge sums by the top 10 defense contractors, which account for $200 billion of the Department of Defense's budget, just to keep those contracts going because they're so lucrative for the Department of Defense and in turn for these representatives, as these contracts provide jobs in their districts. That leads us to the situation where we're in today, with tons and tons of pork being poured into these very destructive programs, because it's very lucrative to keep doing that for the contractors, for the Department of Defense, and for the politicians. That leads us to our final main point, is that defense is offense, and these systems are inherently insecure. I've highlighted on this page a few of the different implementations of these missile defense systems that we've seen, which have been instigating China's nuclear buildup. Because of how uncertain the systems are and how little certainty there is around their performance from flight tests, other countries are forced to prepare for them to work entirely, because there might be a plausible scenario where the THAAD battery is able to shoot down all of their missiles. So they're forced to build more to overcome the THAAD battery. But then we build more THAAD batteries to shoot down all of their missiles. And it's an endless cycle that you may know is referred to as an arms race. There's a few specific places that I want to point out where this is happening. One is that we've deployed the THAAD battery system in South Korea to counter North Korea's ballistic missile tests and also China's nuclear missile program. That specific implementation is encouraging North Korea and China to pursue their nuclear program, where China has tripled their stockpile in the last 20 years and is continuing to expand it far beyond what they previously had. For decades before the 2000s, China had never increased their nuclear stockpile because they never had a reason to. They had enough missiles to carry out the strategic objectives that they felt were needed to remain secure and prevent the US from striking China first, and never decided to build beyond that until there was a possibility of their missiles being shot down. This is the over-preparedness, which is so scary. It encourages countries to build up massive nuclear stockpiles we've been working decades to get rid of. Another example is that the Department of Defense has invested billions of dollars to defend Guam and put interceptors and missile defense all over the small island. This is also encouraging China's nuclear buildup. And an article I'm linking at the bottom refers to the specific ways that China has enacted soft and hard power revenge against the US through, manipulating with our economics, using tariffs, and engaging in military buildup, as well as even applying pressure to nearby US allies in the region. Missile defense sounds great, and in theory, if it worked, it could be great. But in its current state, it destabilizes the peace between China and the US and greater increases the chance that a conflict might arise. And that if a conflict does arise, that it's inflammatory and destructive to billions of people. This is specifically what I'm referring to. In 2000, President George W. Bush left the anti-ballistic missile treaty that had previously been signed between the US and the former Soviet Union. This treaty had prevented the construction of anti-ballistic missile systems or missile defense, as we've been talking about, purely for the reasons that I've stated today. We knew back in the 60s and 70s that these systems would hamper the security of the United States and of other countries, and just force countries to build up nuclear stockpiles. And we signed an agreement, and then we left it. And that's why you see ballistic missile defense spending skyrocket after 2000. It's because we walked back that policy, and we instigated a new arms race by emphasizing missile defense and provoking China. And here's the graphic to show you exactly where that happens. Notice that China's missile defense buildup is almost entirely flat up until 2005, where we're able to start to see how China has begun, the results of their change in policy as a result of us incorporating missile defense. And you can see that beyond 2020, these numbers only get worse and worse and even more terrifying. So what do we do next? This all sounds horrifying, and I would agree if that's what you're thinking. The truth is that there's only one path forward. The United States needs to cut military spending and shift its money elsewhere. The article I link at the top for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists argues that those two pressing threats are pandemics and climate change. I've hinged on climate change because I think it's most relevant, but I also agree that pandemics are an important piece of this. Step one is cutting military spending. We need to cut pork, fat programs which aren't actually improving our security, but worsening it. I've identified a fantastic one to start with. The program that will cost us in the next 5 years over $300 billion is a great place to start and begins to give us the type of money that we need to invest in more important pressing issues. We need to cancel failed programs. We know that GMD, FAD, and AGIS do not work because we've been trying to make them work for 40 years. It's time to say they don't work. We got to do something else and invest that money in more pressing threats. Instead, we should pivot towards active denial. This is a strategy promoted by a lot of defense scholars that basically says that instead of investing in programs which promote uncertainty and lead to more dangerous scenarios between us and our adversaries, we should invest in programs which make it difficult to conceive invasion. Make conflict with the United States appear very costly and difficult and arduous, not enhance our ability to strike first. By being able to shoot down more of their missiles, we can get more of our missiles through before they hit our silos. That is not the type of calculus we need to be looking at. Instead, we need to avoid those missiles being launched in the first place and invest in the State Department and the USAID and other programs which deny any conflict whatsoever. And we need to spend on climate. The science has showed us that if we do and directly invest in climate, we can prevent a climate disaster. And that message is so important because for many people, we've flipped from avoiding a climate disaster to reducing harm. But we're still in the window where we can prevent it. And we must act while we still can. Thank you for listening to my little talk. And I look forward to presenting again at the Undergrad Research Conference at the U of O later in 2024.